So now I'm going to go over some of the requirements for being put into the TxGANG database. And this is a long list, folks. So I have a piece of paper in front of me. I have it broken down into the very specific things that could potentially get somebody put in there. And these are really important to know. So requirements for actually being put into the gang database, the law enforcement agency must find some of these things, okay? So if one of these two things applies, that could result in entry into the TxGANG database. So the first is a judicial finding that includes as part of the criminal offense that the individual's participation is in a criminal street gang. The second would be judicial self-admission by an individual of criminal street gang membership. So really practical examples of these. Typically, these two are gonna involve an arrest. So you would know that your information is gonna be put in there. The first one, a judicial finding about the criminal offense. So think about getting charged. Maybe there's some probable cause, some warrants issued, either for search or arrest. And then your information gets put in there because there's that judicial finding. The second is probably more important, and a practical example of this would be somebody questioning you, a law enforcement agency questioning you, or an informant questioning you, and you saying, yes, I belong to insert the organization, which they assume, again, is some sort of gang, or there's some sort of gang-related activity going on with that organization. So if you meet either one of those, then your information can be put in. Now, we're gonna get into the more nascent, sort of gray area stuff where you have to meet a couple different pieces of criteria to potentially be put into the TxGANG database. So, I'm gonna read off this list of different criteria that potentially, if you meet, you'll be put in there. And you have to meet two of these pieces of criteria. The first is non-judicial self-admission by an individual of a criminal street gang member. Or criminal street gang membership. So think about this, probably goes back more to the informant stuff. Maybe you don't know that they're an informant. Maybe you're out there and maybe you post on social media or something that you are part of a certain organization, and that potentially meets that one piece of criteria. The second is identification of the individual as a criminal street gang member by a reliable informant or other individual. So now we're talking, okay, police have somebody out there, they're just kind of observing, and they can identify you. And they use the word credible, as a practical matter. I think credibility, it's kind of a loosely used term that's thrown around out there, but nonetheless, that is potentially a piece of criteria that if you meet, you can be put in there. The third is identification of the individual as a criminal street gang member by a reliable informant or other individual and corroborated by an informant or other individual of unknown reliability. So you can kind of see the issues there. Now we're saying, okay, well, you're identified by an informant, and it kind of goes against that last piece by saying, and there's an additional person that identifies you regardless of their credibility. So now we're starting to get more and more gray, more and more nascent, probably more and more to the point where you're not even going to know that your information is entered. The fourth is evidence that the individual uses in more than an incidental manner criminal street gang dress, hand signals, tattoos, or symbols that are associated with the criminal street gang that operates in an area frequented by the individual. So now, this one is kind of fraught with problems because maybe there's an organization that's viewed as some sort of criminal street gang, but they're not doing a lot of stuff. We run into this a lot. I have a lot of friends that are in motorcycle clubs, a lot of people that are bikers, and a lot of them get this bad reputation as this kind of sons of anarchy group, but they're really not. In fact, a lot of them do some really good work out there in the community. Here in El Paso, our local coalition does a lot of charity work. A lot of the clubs actually donate to really good causes. They do a toy run. So it becomes problematic because you get labeled right away, and you're essentially the book that gets judged based on the cover without much more going into it. We've also had cases where cops just assume a lot, and they don't know that, like if I didn't have friends in this world, I wouldn't know about the different cuts, the different clubs and stuff like that and what they're doing, but they just kind of lump everybody into the same bucket. Fifth piece of criteria. Evidence that the individual has been arrested or taken into custody with known criminal street gang members for an offense or conduct consistent with criminal street gang activity. Again, we're slapping these big labels on there. There are some definitions in both the Texas Penal Code and the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure that can kind of help us shape this, but a lot of this is sort of an on-the-spot assessment or some sort of law enforcement assessment, and they're just kind of trying to interpret as best they can what is going on out there. Sixth piece of criteria: evidence that the individual uses technology, including the internet, to recruit new criminal street gang members. So think about this. Let me give you a practical example. Again, going back to the motorcycle club world, maybe you host an event and your club says, hey, everybody come on out, we're looking for new members. Well, if you're unknowingly already identified as a criminal street gang, that could be problematic, and that could lead to falling under this piece of criteria, which again is in a very gray area. Number 7, evidence that the individual frequents a documented area of criminal street gangs and associates with known criminal street gang members. Guys, you can see how problematic that can be. In my mind, when I read that, it really feels like guilt by association. So just based on where you hang out, maybe you have certain friends that do things that are in clubs, maybe that are considered criminal street gangs, again, without this high evidentiary standard or burden, that could be problematic. In fact, there's cases that happened right here in El Paso, Texas, where somebody was put into the database, and those cases, some of them are being litigated right now, unknowingly, because they attended things like funerals or gatherings. So just keep that in mind. And number 8 is evidence that the individual has visited a known criminal street gang member other than a family member of the individual while the individual is confined or committed in a penal institution. So now we're looking at people who you've had contact with, and this is in a sort of a confinement facility scenario. So they're gonna have documented the names of people that come in, that have any contact with anyone. And again, it becomes problematic because each of these pieces of criteria is built on a bunch of assumptions. And when you start really drilling down into it to see what can be verified, what can't be verified, it becomes really problematic. And probably, the most important thing to realize here is that this is not something where you receive traditional notice, as we would say in the law. So you're not going to get a letter or anything like that to your house typically, unless there's an arrest or something like that involved. And even then you may not get notice of being entered into the Texas Gang database. But we're really talking about situations where you're lumped into this system and your information could potentially be used later on for a prosecution. And I know, I've probably repeated myself a bunch of times, but that becomes problematic because now we're dealing with people's civil rights and their right to privacy and just their being able to associate with people. Freedom of speech, big one here, because if you're wearing certain things with certain organizations on them, could that lead you to being entered into the Texas Gang database? Well, potentially. If you go to certain gatherings, could that happen? Well, potentially. And so it's very, from a defense standpoint, it's very problematic that we have all of these assumptions built in.